Hello, everybody. You're very welcome to today's event, the Digital Services Act, an initial review. I'm Seamus Allen. I am a researcher here at the IIEA, and today's event is part of a collaboration between the IIEA and the Economic Regulators Network, the ERN, a cross-sectoral network of regulators here in Ireland. We're delighted today to be joined by our expert panel, who I'll now briefly introduce. We have John Evans, the Digital Services Commissioner from Coimisiún Meán. We have Irene Roche Laguna, the Head of Unit for Coordination and Regulatory Compliance in DG Connect in the European Commission, dealing with the DSA and the DMA. Irene is a surprise guest speaker today. She saw our event and saw the panel and thought it looked so good she couldn't resist the temptation. So she hopped on a plane and flew from Brussels just to be with us today, which is a big compliment. We have Dr. Eileen Cullity, the Deputy Director of the DCU Institute for Future Media, Democracy and Society. And she's also the coordinator of the Ireland EDMO Hub, the European Digital Media Observatory. Joining us online, we have Professor Nathalie Hellberger, Professor of Law and Digital Technologies at the University of Amsterdam, and a member of the project team for the DSA Observatory. Nathalie was actually just defending a research proposal right before this, so she told us she may be a minute or two late, but she will tell them she has a lot more important things to be doing than answering their questions. Oh, I think she's with us already, which will be answering our questions. So we're delighted to have such a great panel with us. Thank you again. And just the running order for today, I'll go to the panel first, and each of them will make opening remarks up to a maximum of 10 minutes each. We then go to a discussion and a Q&A. For the audience joining us online, you can send in questions using the Q&A on the bottom of your screen. For the audience here in person today, I'll come to you in due course, and you can raise your hand, and I'll come to you one by one to ask your questions. A reminder that the event today and the Q&A are both on the record, and when you ask a question, please give your name and your organization. Now, before I turn to the panel, I'll just again thank the Economic Regulators Network for supporting today's event. The Economic Regulators Network includes Coimisiún Meán, the CCPC, Comreg, the Central Bank of Ireland, CRU, the Commission for Aviation Regulation, and the National Transport Authority. Thank you so much, and thank you so much to our panel for being with us. I'll now go to them, and I'll hand over to you first, John. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Seamus. First of all, just many thanks for the invite. I've done a few of these sessions now with the IIEA and the Economic Regulators Network, and I find them very, very useful. Definitely, it kind of gives us a good opportunity to meet different stakeholders than we normally would. So I think I'm going to kind of cover three things. I'm going to say a little bit about the kind of activity over the last year at Coimisiún Meán. I'll say a little bit then about kind of our supervision work and how that's developing. And then I'll just make a few observations at the end. I'll try to keep it short enough. So under the Digital Services Act, it creates in each member state a digital services coordinator. So there's one of me in each of the member states of Europe. We were one of the first DSEs to be empowered on day one, which was I think February 17th, 2024. And we were able to turn up to the first Digital Services Board meeting, which I think was the following Tuesday, as a fully fledged DSE, and that was a really great thing to do. And I always make the point of saying this, that we had the support of the Irish government in getting resources and having the legislation in place so that we would be ready for day one, and we were, and I think that puts us in a very strong position. So on day one, we had a few things up and running, but we were still pretty much just kind of a skeleton organization in a lot of ways. We had our contact center open, we were taking complaints, and we were also open to the certification of third parties. So the Digital Services Act creates this thing for trusted flaggers. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second, but also for out-of-court dispute settlement bodies. So we were taking applications for those, and then later this year, and maybe Irene might mention this as well, we will also be responsible for vetting researchers for data access under Article 40 of the Digital Services Act. So since it's 14 months ago since we were open for business, we've had about 2,500 contacts to our contact center. Through the other digital services coordinators, we've received about 500 complaints About 80% of them are coming from digital services coordinators in other member states, and 20% of them have kind of emanated through contacts made, for example, through our contact center on other mechanisms. On the certification of third parties, we certified the Appeal Centre of Europe back in the autumn. That's a big piece of the infrastructure. And we certified our first trusted flagger just last week, which is the central bank, which I think is a really positive movement. We've also been building up capacity and developing depth and scope to our supervision work at Coimisiún Meán. So Coimisiún Meán as a DSC occupies a somewhat unusual space in Europe in that so many of the very large online platforms are based in Ireland. So of the 25, 15 of them are based in Ireland. So that means there's quite a lot of responsibility on us. The way the Digital Services Act is constructed is that the European Commission has sole responsibility for certain parts of it, and then we have a shared responsibility for other articles. So that means there's quite an important role for Coimisiún Meán to play here. Then there is also the below threshold platforms. We estimate that there's about 150 of those based in Ireland. So that we call below threshold is they have less than 45 million users in the EU. So there's a couple of big name brands in that who are based in Ireland. And then there's some 200 odd other intermediate service providers who also fall within the ambit of the Digital Services Act. So as a supervision task, getting to know your regulated entities has been a bit of a journey. Obviously, we're very clear on who the very large online platforms are, but we're developing our capability and our knowledge of who the other platforms and other intermediary service providers are. The heaviest burden of regulation falls on the very large online platforms, and then it tends to be tailored then for online platforms that are not above that 45 million threshold, and then below that for intermediary service providers of other kinds have a lesser regulatory obligation, but a regulatory obligation nonetheless. In our supervision work, we always say we can't open investigations of every firm. There's so many of them. So we pursue a risk-based approach to regulation. So we've identified what we think are kind of key harm areas and which therefore we think are the riskier platforms. So by virtue of the size, the very large online platforms fall into that, but below thresholds can also fall into that riskier category. Some of them are quite significant. Some of them have audiences or customer bases that are quite young. Some of them offer particular kinds of services, which by their nature are more risky in terms of potential harm. So we try to prioritize. Through our complaints mechanism, one of the things we noticed last year was a pattern whereby there were a lot of people complaining or telling us that it was very difficult to flag illegal content online. So this is Article 16 of the Digital Services Act. So based on that kind of pattern of information that we were getting from our complaint center, we opened up what we call kind of a review of a number of platforms. So that included 7 or 8 very large online platforms and a number of below thresholds as well. So that work has been developing, and that's kind of, we see that as it's a very fundamental piece of the architecture for online safety. If you're not able to report illegal content in a way that's easily done, there's something wrong with the system. It's not working in a fundamental way. But we've been developing in other areas as well. So we often talk about our kind of strategic outcome areas of focus for the organization. So the 2 top ones last year, I would say, were minor protection and democracy. So I often speak of, we don't just do the Digital Services Act at Coimisiún Meán. We think of the Digital Services Act as being one of the 3 legs of the online safety framework that we have. We also have terrorist content online, and we also have our online safety code. Our online safety code, among other things, is quite focused on minor protection. So it would include some obligations around age assurance and the inclusion of parental controls on platforms that carry certain types of content. So minor protection has been a big piece of our work over the last year. So we adopted an online safety code just last year, And I'm sure Irina will talk a little bit about the work that's going on Article 28, which is very welcome. That's the minor protection article of the DSA, which we're doing a lot of work on ourselves. Democracy was a big issue last year. We put a lot of effort into developing our capability there. We had 3 of our own elections last year. We also participated in kind of a number of scenario kind of gaming workshops run by the European Commission, and then in different national elections run by the local DSCs. We were involved in the development of a toolkit for DSCs who are dealing with elections, and that includes kind of many practical things like how best to coordinate different institutions that are involved in that kind of democratic integrity ecosystem. So organizations like fact-checking organizations, the Electoral Commission, organizations like ourselves, An Garda Síochána. We had a joint pack put out with An Garda Síochána, which was aimed at providing information to candidates who are putting themselves forward for election. The big concern, especially for candidates who are women or who are coming from minority groups, was that they were facing hateful content online, and that might discourage them. And we were trying to provide them with information so that they would know what to do if that were to happen to them. So we did that with An Garda Síochána. This year, we're continuing to develop. So we 3 other strategic outcomes we have are fraud or online trust, as we talk about it. Then there's hate, which is sort of the opposite of kind of diversity of conversation online. And then there's also the public safety work. The public safety piece relates to things like our terrorist content online regulation, but also potentially content online that may affect the health of our children negatively, or skinny content or misogynist content. We're doing work on those areas. In the fraud area, just last week, I mentioned this a few minutes ago, we announced that the central bank is our first trusted flagger. And we think this is a really important development because that's a very well-resourced, skilled, expert organization is now flagging content about fraud and scams online. And we hope that will have a real positive impact for the prevalence of that material online. So you can kind of hear from what I'm saying that the Digital Services Act is really across a very broad range of harms. It's almost a bit too big of a job for me, and it definitely is too big of a job for me, but it's not just a job for me. There's all the other digital services coordinators and the European Commission with whom we work very closely. Just finish up by making 3 observations very quickly. One is, if you kind of roll back to the debate 2 or 3 years, you would have heard from industry that they wanted clear regulation in this area. And I think part of the reason for that is that they were probably facing different initiatives in different countries. And part of the reason for the Commission developing the Digital Services Act was really kind of an internal markets issue. We wanted to make sure that there were common standards across the different states. So that's achieved, but now they want to be regulated, and now they really don't want to be regulated. So the reality of regulation is now settling down. It's a sector that hasn't been regulated in this way before, and there's a lot of norms, I would say, being established. That's the first thing. The second thing I'd like to say is the C in the Digital Services Coordinator has been much more complicated than I thought. So Rwanda's working with the European Commission and the other digital services coordinators, and there's quite a lift there, and that's going to grow. That takes quite an investment for the organization to do that work well, but it's important that we do it well. But then domestically, we need to link in with civil society groups. We need to link in with other regulators, law enforcement agencies. There's quite a list. A lot of interested government departments because it crosses over so many harm areas. From the Department of Health to the Department of Housing, Tourism, Culture and Arts. There's sort of something for everybody in the audience in the Digital Services Act, and that's a key thing about it. Then the last thing I'd say is that sort of 1 year or 14 months on, I'm confident that the pipeline of material that we're developing is becoming mature. So we're going to be moving from a phase where we're having conversations about what good looks like to starting to tell people that's not good enough. We need to see change. The preferable approach is that we see behavioral change without having to go to enforcement, but we will be ready to go to enforcement and fully expect to go to enforcement, and quite quickly in certain circumstances. So that's all to watch in this space over the next few months. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. Lots of really interesting things to pick up on there, I think. But for now, we'll go over to Irene for her remarks. Thank you.
Just to put things in a broader perspective and show what John has explained, what kind of deliverable it means. The DSA was proposed by the Commission in December 2020 and was agreed. The last trilogue was in April 2022, so 1.5 years later. It entered into application for all platforms in February last year. And in May 2023, we designated the first very large online platform. So if you compare, the GDPR took all this time just to be adopted. And the DSA has moved very fast from the beginning, and now we are moving very fast. And all the deliverables that John has explained are built always in urgency, because there is a general understanding that the DSA needs to bring the results that we have promised. So I would like to focus my introduction in 4 areas. The DSA gives to the European Commission different roles, and we have different hats. And we are enforcers for the first time. Beyond antitrust, we have the same powers that the Commission traditionally has had in the field of competition for the DSA and for the DMA. But we are also the secretary, sorry, it's a bit noisy, the secretary of the board. So we have organized the structure of the DSA board and built a very good relationship with the digital services coordinators. We are still and will continue being the guardian of the treaties. And we are also delegated legislators. The DSA, there where the co-legislators did not know exactly what they wanted, they gave an empowerment to the Commission, you will figure out. And this is a work that continues ongoing. So what are our priorities in these areas? As enforcer, you may know we have already opened several investigations. They are ongoing. We have 10 open cases. We may open new ones, but also during this time, we have worked hard on the investigations. We have worked also very closely together with Commissioner Meán, because many of the usual suspects happen to be established in Ireland. And we will move very quickly, soon, into the conclusion of those investigations. We also have 11 cases before the court. This is something that does not necessarily meet the headlines, but we have 5 very large online platforms contesting the designation. We also have some cases on the supervisory fee, where the platforms are contesting some of our calculations. And we continue on a regular basis what we call the regulatory dialogue. Our goal is not to issue fines. Our goal is to meet compliance by the very large online platforms. And this is something that is working, in the majority of the cases, is working well. So the message is that the DSA has already brought results. It's not because we don't issue fines that we are not bringing results. It's rather the opposite. So as secretary of the board, our priority number 1 was to build this DSA team. It's not only the Commission for the very large online platforms. The DSA applies also below the threshold for the platforms that are smaller. Everyone, sometimes I have read in the news, Telegram is not captured under the DSA because they are not a very large online platform. They are. It's just that there is a different structure. We have the digital services coordinator of the place that they have chosen for the legal representative, who is responsible. But this is an enormous work. It is also very pleasant work, because we have seen the digital services coordinators investing a lot of time in adapting the national realities. What John was mentioning, the C of the coordinators part is a difficult one, because the DSA came on top of many other regulations and many other regulators, and we have to ensure that everything works fine so that all problems are tackled at the right level. But as guardian of the treaties, we are also investing a lot of time to ensure that those students who are not that good as Ireland in empowering the DSCs or to designate the DSCs move fast. Last week, we sent 5 countries to the Court of Justice because they had not empowered yet, 1 year and some months after, the digital services coordinator. So for instance, in Cyprus, and it's not a naming and shaming, it's an example. Cyprus is known for hosting many pornographic platforms. So if they are not designated as very large online platforms, they are only subject to the supervision of the regulator in Cyprus. That regulator needs to have powers. Otherwise, we are not protected, and minors are not protected for those platforms. And we also check that at national level, legislators do not reinvent the wheel, that they do not adopt new national laws that basically do the same as the DSA or try to gold-plate the DSA or any other instrument of a union law. So this is a parallel work that is done also in the context of the DSA. As delegated legislator, John has mentioned the Delegated Act on Data Access. We think that this is fundamental. It has taken us a bit longer than expected. We wanted to move fast, precisely to give access to researchers and to be our eyes and our ears, and in a way to federate supervision and oversight. Obviously, the Commission is supervising, digital services coordinators are supervising, but researchers build a community that can give us pointers to where there are systemic risks. And I think this is an essential work, and we have a lot of hope on the access to data for researchers as an avenue to improve compliance. But also, we have worked on guidelines. We issued guidelines in the context of elections, and it was very useful during last year and also this year. It was a very loaded year in terms of elections, and very large online platforms, in our view, appreciated the efforts to provide guidance on what we expect or what the DSA expects them to do in terms of risk assessment and risk mitigation. We have just yesterday published for public consultation, and this is my promotion here, we have issued draft guidelines for the protection of minors on Article 28 of the DSA. It's not only for very large online platforms, it's precisely for every platform except for small and micro platforms. The guidelines give an understanding of what we consider that is expected from online platforms that are accessible to minors, to provide a high level of privacy, safety, and security to these minors. It is subject to public consultation, so I invite everyone online and offline to take a look, to give your views, your understanding, if you disagree, if you have evidence in favor or against what we are saying. This is information that we will carefully work with and then publish the final version, hopefully before the summer break, whatever that means in Brussels times. But this is our main priority. In terms of enforcement, we have focused on protection of minors, on avoiding dissemination of illegal content, on online marketplaces, the proliferation of non-compliant products from third countries is very worrying. And John mentioned financial scams. This is also something that we see emerging in the discussions. I was also meeting the central bank a few hours ago, and it is very important to show that online platforms have a role to play already under the DSA. There are now negotiations ongoing in the payment services regulation, but we need to avoid that the legal framework becomes complicated and becomes impossible to know which rule applies where. So this is an element that we are also investing time on. So just for conclusion, we have busy times behind us and we have busy times ahead of us. But the coordination with the Digital Services Coordinator, with Commissioner Meán, is working very well, and it is necessary to bring the DSA to a success.
Thank you so much, Irene. You are very busy, so it's great you could be with us, and we'll talk about a lot of those topics in more detail soon. We'll now turn to Eileen for her remarks.
I think I'm here as the panel contrarian of sorts, because my views on the DSA are somewhat ambivalent at the moment, and sometimes that veers into pessimism. And before I explain why, I wanted to really stress that that's not a criticism exactly of the work that you're doing there. I think that the DSA is a very impressive and ambitious piece of legislation in itself, and it achieves a lot. You think of securing rights for individuals, forcing platforms to focus on processes and risk, recognizing a role for experts and trusted flaggers and external actors, and trying its best to minimize potentials for political interference. That's what you would want from a piece of regulation that is a system that is a success in itself. The problem is we needed that system 20 years ago. We needed platforms to be forced to explain why they were not causing harm and what they were doing to protect the public interest 20 years ago. And it feels a little like now the challenge is the house is already on fire and we've come up with a brilliant system of fire safety regulation. And no matter how brilliant that system is, there is always going to be that sense of disappointment, but how are we putting out the fire? And so I think we're in a series of tech-induced and tech-facilitated crises. And by crises, I don't mean the kind of crisis that, you know, the crisis mechanism addresses. So an event arises, there's a crisis mechanism that can address it. We're talking about much more systemic things. So my main criticisms, I think, are around the systemic risk model, where we're asking them to please tell us how you have assessed risks and what you might do. You know, again, the sense of urgency that people feel, and surveys bear this out. People are very concerned about the impact technology is having on our democracy, on our societies, on the mental well-being of our children and our communities. And then you match that to a system that's like compliance reports, audit cycles, researchers negotiating access for data, and all of this playing out down the line. I think there's just going to be an awful lot of disappointment. So I see three main kind of issues for the DSA, and I'm very much coming at from the perspective of ordinary people who want a better society and they want better technology, and also the politicians who I don't normally express a lot of sympathy for, but ultimately they're the ones who are going to be going, what are you doing about this? How are you dealing with this? And so I think three of the issues are, one is what you might call the hype reality gap, where there was a lot of hype around the DSA. And I don't know whether the people who were promoting it initially were doing it consciously or unconsciously, but it was very much, well, don't worry, that problem is going to be addressed by the DSA. If I had time this morning, I would love to have done a LexisNexis search for news stories that contain the phrase, the DSA will, and then add in disinformation, hate, and all of these problems. So a lot of expectations were built up around what the DSA would do, but it isn't actually what it was designed to do. It's a lot of compliance reporting and like standard regulatory stuff. It's not designed to address directly those big issues. The second thing is about the entire co-regulatory model, which makes a massive, massive assumption that these platforms are going to act in good faith. And I think that's a bit of a leap to expect anybody at this point to actually believe that. So it's another hurdle to get over. Why should we believe that they will fairly and accurately conduct risk assessments? Why should we believe that they will listen to the external experts at the roundtables and listen to researchers? They haven't done any of it so far. And then thirdly is about the experts and the researchers and the civil society organizations. I think it's brilliant that all this, like in an ideal world, this would be a perfect piece of legislation, but we don't live in that ideal world. And the role for the researchers and the civil society organizations, it's brilliant that it's there, but it's also pretty vague. And what happens from the roundtables, what happens at the calls for expertise, and what happens when the platforms just don't listen anyway? People will stop participating. I think a lot of researchers are already, if you take the topic of misogyny and gender abuse and that, a lot of people who research in that area, they're not at the point of going, I need to sit on another roundtable, I need to apply for more and more access. They see the problems already, and what they're saying is stuff needs to be done now. So I think when you put, and maybe a final point on the civil society and the researchers. So we want them to provide this expertise, but these are the exact organizations and entities that are currently under attack. They're being defunded, they're being discredited, and they're being harassed. Some of the people who are doing this harassment and defunding are the people who run the platforms that the DSA is supposed to be co-regulating with. On top of that, they have the direct ear of a man who unfortunately is the most powerful person in the world. And on top of that, there's some of the richest people that have ever existed. And I think when you put all that together, that's when I start veering from ambivalence into pessimism. And again, I don't want it to be as a criticism of the really good work that all the people did to put into creating the structure of the DSA, but as a public, that sense of crisis out of where on earth will we be in 5 years' time, the DSA sounds like a kind of a cold comfort. Yeah, so that's my kind of contrary response.
Thank you so much, Eileen. That's all really useful, and we look forward to discussing it all. For now, we'll turn to Natalie, who I think is with us online.
Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for inviting me and also the really interesting presentations already. And thank you also for giving me the opportunity to Zoom in online. As Seamus already said, I have just defended before the Dutch Science Foundation a project to actually look into how we can help citizens with transparency, but also concrete tools of intervention to really have a more active participatory role in all this, because citizens very much feel that all this algorithmic stuff is really overcoming them. Before I start, I would really like to thank Eileen also for making this point of researcher, and in a personal capacity as a researcher myself, I really would like to emphasize that the discussion around access to data is super important, and I think the precondition for us researchers to really play a role. But we need more than access to data. So researchers do not only live on data and air. We really need also support and that policymakers create the conditions so that we can do our work. And this might sound evident under the current situation, not only in the US, but also in Europe. This is far from evident. And I really also think that researchers have a lot to offer here and contribute to this debate. And what I would like to do in the next 8 minutes or so is actually share with you some of the research findings to bring forward another group that is not so often heard in the discussions around the DSA, although the DSA is very much meant to protect this group, which is citizens and users. And I would like to talk about the rules on recommender systems from a user perspective and present you with some empirical normative research we've been doing at the DSA Observatory and the IIEA Media Democracy Lab. To really inform also this discussion of now we have the DSA, but how can we enforce it and operationalize in a way that it makes sense for consumers? Talking about the recommender provisions, and I mean, I'm probably preaching here to the educated, you all know that, but there are 3 main regulations of recommending systems under the DSA. And I trust that we all understand recommender systems, so that these are the algorithms that power these platforms and decide which information to show users or not. The DSA made some really important steps there. First of all, there's an obligation to be transparent about the main parameters used in these recommender systems. So why are people seeing what they're seeing? Then there are two additional obligations for very large online platforms. These online platforms must offer at least one option for each of the recommender systems to not be based on profiling. And flops also must identify and mitigate potential systemic threats, including those stemming from their recommender design. So far, so good. So how do these provisions are perceived from the perspective of citizens and users, and to what extent do they reflect their interests and needs, and what can we do to do so better? Let's first look at this whole discussion of transparency about recommender systems and what it means, main parameter used. Actually, it's a bit unclear what main parameters used means. I think we're converging on a rather technical interpretation. So according to the DSA, this would be the criteria which are used, which are most significant in making recommendations, and the reason for the relative weight or importance of these criteria. So technical information about the algorithm. But in a representative experimental study we did, for example, in the Netherlands, we found that only a very small part of our sample was interested in the technical details. And instead, the information that they really wanted and needed from and about recommender systems was information about the sources of news recommended. Can we actually trust the information that we're seeing or not? But also not some generic descriptions. You're seeing that because you've been signaled interest in sports, but also what are actually the data and the kinds of profiles that are used to generate these recommendations. Being explained the logic behind recommendations, but also, for example, the ability to understand what the impact of recommendations is, for example, by comparing recommendations, by seeing what others are exposed to, and also how to exercise control over recommendations or giving feedback. So meaningful recommender transparency really needs to respond to concrete information needs. And I don't even think we need to change the laws here, but take a broader interpretation of what main parameters used means, and that this not only means technical information, but indeed also information about the pool and trustworthiness of the information recommended, the kind of profiles users have, and the control options that we give them. That's my first example. The second example is the provision in the DSA on the ability to switch off personalization. There was a lot of discussions about recommender systems and how to regulate them, and also regulate the public interest aspects of recommender systems. Because let's be very clear of that. Recommender systems are the digital infrastructure of our information economy. They are the ways we inform ourselves today. And with that, they have not only the market maker function, but really an important information function for large parts of the population. So in response to these discussions, there is this provision where users should have on very large platforms the right to switch off personalization. And looking at the data in the Netherlands, but also in a comparative European survey, we found that actually a large majority of participants really indicated that they found it useful and their inclination to disable personalization. But then if you ask them why they want to disable information, only a very few were actually concerned about issues around data protection or privacy, so the profiling aspects. The most important reasons why people want to switch off personalization is because they are concerned about what this does to their position as information consumers and their information position. So there are concerns about the value of personalization over generalized news, concerns about filter bubbles, the desire for control over the content they see, but also their ability to actually explore news content. So as you see, these are not so much concerns about privacy, but really concerns about how can we ensure that recommendations not optimized only for maximum engagement, but that actually we receive trustworthy information, are not in filter bubbles, and so forth. And something that we talk less about is, but there are also people who actually value personalization. For example, to increase user efficiency, usefulness, and relevance of the information. And to some extent, this right to switch on or off personalization is a very binary choice that takes away from users to actually benefit from the potential positive effects that recommenders have for their information management. Because in the times of information abundance we are moving now, recommenders actually crucially needed to manage this incredible amount of information. So recommenders can be very valuable to consumers, provided they're optimized to advance users' interests and address their information concerns. So how could that look like? In response to these provisions on the obligation to offer one non-profit version, Meta, for example, gave users the choice to either subscribe and pay or use the products for free, but continue with apps. So this whole question of switching off personalization was essentially morphed into a question about paying for your privacy and whether you want to or not receive ads. And I think we can all agree that this is not really optimizing for recommenders that help people to manage their information ecosystem. And then, of course, it's easy to criticize and say what doesn't work. So with the team, we also looked into how could a more favorable recommender environment look like for consumers. So try to make also some constructive suggestions to the debate. And based on political theory and grounded in fundamental rights analysis, we formulated as a more constructive approach a right to constructive recommendations, or an idea how recommendations that cater to information needs of users could actually look like. And our conclusion is in a paper with Laurens Nauts, Michael Wiel, and Marijn Sachs, is that recommender systems are critical nowadays for the realization of the right of freedom of expression, but also privacy and non-discrimination. And based on that, users have a legitimate interest under fundamental rights law to have actual say in the optimization goals, so that recommender systems are not optimized only and exclusively for commercial gain, but also for their situation as information consumers, which also involves offering meaningful choice and voice. So not only offering the opportunity to switch on or off personalization, but actually offering meaningful personalization logics that help users to navigate the public space. And include in this process also their voices. Because we tend to see recommender systems very much as this black box, an algorithm, and rely on platforms to tell us what works and not. But the fact is that the way these systems are optimized very much reflects the business KPIs and business goals of the platforms using them. And with very large online platforms, this can not only be about commercial profit only, because these platforms are part of our public information infrastructure. And that also means there needs to be some responsibility to include actually also the interests of users. And the final condition is understanding the rules of the game. So how could this be realized in practice? We very much look at recommenders at the moment as a risk to democracy. I tried to explain to you why they're also an opportunity for democracy, provided there's also a positive obligation to include and consider the interests of users and the diversity of users along the entire development chain, for example, in making business decisions what to optimize for. That also involves giving users an actual choice between different recommendation logics and involving them by means of co-design or feedback loops into the design process, and give them the information they need to evaluate recommenders upon their value. And again, this does not require entire new laws. I think with the existing framework, if we interpret it in a social and technical way that also takes user interest into account, there's a lot of room. For example, interpreting the design of a recommender system, not only in purely technical means, but also in terms of the managerial decisions that went into the system. And then we could argue that, for example, the failure to demonstrate how to include a user perspective could be actually a strong indicator of a systemic risk to the fundamental rights of freedom of expression and non-discrimination and democracy under Article 34. Right now, making alternative recommendation logics is not mandatory under Article 24 or 38. This is something that could be reconsidered. Not including different perspectives, as already mentioned, could be a strong indicator for systemic risk because it results in recommender systems that are not aligned and potentially contradict fundamental rights. And we can interpret Article 27 and these parameters in the light of user concrete information needs. So I think at the moment we have the DSA, and I see it as a beginning of a discussion of how to regulate in the space, and as such also a very valuable and important beginning. And now our task is to think of how we can work with these rules and interpret them in a way to also take into account the interests of citizens. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that, Natalie. That was thank you so much, Natalie. That was extremely interesting. And thank you so much for joining us right after defending the research proposal. I hope it went well for you, but it's great that you could join us. We'll now turn to a discussion and to a Q&A. And again, a reminder to our online audience. I think we have over 150 online currently. You can send in your questions using the Q&A button. And I'll turn to our audience here in person in just a moment. But just to start with one or two questions of my own. On the enforcement side and with regards to capabilities, I think we probably all agree, or most people would agree, that regulators are facing a significant challenge, that there are some huge companies to regulate. And in terms of what resources regulators need to be successful, what do they look like? What type of skills, what types of personnel? Does the DSA give sufficient powers to achieve the vision it sets out? And how can those powers be best used? And what does success look like? And I might turn to our panel, in particular for Eileen, maybe what does success look like from a researcher perspective? What's a realistic goal for access for researchers? And a similar question for Natalie, what does success look like in terms of empowering users to control their recommender algorithms? I'll start with you, John, on that question.
On the resources questions and skills mix, bodies numbers are very important, first of all. So in Commission and Meán, we do online safety. We also do kind of media development work and broadcast regulation as a media regulator. We are sanctioned up to 200 people right now. So that's a growth in the organization from at the starting gun, it was 40 back in the summer of 2023. So we've increased fivefold since then over a very short period of time. And we've just been sanctioned for an additional 100 people. So that'll bring us up to about 300. So on the online safety side, the kind of skills that we've been recruiting have been, first of all, experience from other regulatory systems, from competition, financial services, utility regulation. Those skills, just knowing how regulation works, are very important. We placed an emphasis on getting people from platform backgrounds, so that they would know, so that we would have some insight on how those companies worked, how trust and safety operated, and we were quite successful there. We always need lawyers. You can never have too many lawyers. Technical specialists, people coming from policy backgrounds, working in civil society organizations, with sociology and kind of technical sociology qualifications as well. So it's a more varied set of skills than I would have had in previous roles. So my previous role to this was I was chief economist at Comreg, so it's economic regulation was the thing. I needed to learn a little bit about spectrum and how broadcasting and how the frequencies work and so on. And then before that, I was in competition regulation, and that was very much kind of economists and lawyers. So it's a very interesting mix of different backgrounds in the role I'm in now, I have to say. Whether or not we're competitive with people who say want to work in the sector or whatever, our experience so far has been that people have been attracted to the purpose of the organization. And I'm quite happy for someone to spend 3-5 years with us and then off into another role in some other part of the sector. I think that's fine. We'll benefit from that. That's okay. But we have found that people have been motivated by the purpose. Not difficult to get the kind of skills we need so far.
Thank you, John. I'll go over to you now, Irene, if you want to share your thoughts on the question.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of resources and skills, I share very much what John said. I think for skills, it needs to be a mix. Obviously, we are not short of lawyers in the European Commission, but it was more difficult to find data scientists and people who understood how platforms work. And we worked together with the other services in the European Commission. We opened the European Center for Algorithmic Transparency, and it has become a hub for this kind of knowledge. And we work very closely together with them to do experiments, to test, for instance, recommend a system, to test the algorithms, to know whether what platforms tell us that they are doing is really true. And this is something that we didn't have before. And it is new. We have now around 200 people in Brussels. We have also hired one DSA officer in each capital, and the one in Dublin is also in the room. We also think that we need to go to the capitals to explain what the Commission is doing, to explain what the DSA can bring in terms of our powers of enforcement. And we also, if we count heads of the DSA team, we count our 200, your 200, and everyone's, all DSCs together, it is already quite a corpus of enforcers. And this is how we want to present it. Obviously, the DSA will not solve all problems, and I fully agree with you. The DSA should not be expected to solve all problems, but we should be expected to solve the problems that we can handle. And this is how I would define success. We are trying to prioritize in these early days, because I still consider to be in early days of the DSA. We focus and we prioritize the areas where we think we have most impact, or we can have most impact, where the house is really burning. But for me, success would be that users, citizens, know that the DSA is there, that they know that they have rights, that they exercise these opt-outs and opt-ins and the different possibilities that they have to report content, to issue complaints when they don't agree. So far, it was always like, oh, the platform took this decision, so bad. And the DSA creates new rights. And if it becomes normal knowledge and acceptance by users that this is something that they can do, for me, that would be success.
All right. Thank you so much, Irene. I will now come to Eileen.
Yeah, so in terms of researcher access to data, I mean, it's great that Article 40 is there. I think some of our former colleagues are actually working on it at Coimisiún and Meán. And it's almost become like a standard over the past 5 or 6 years. If there's any panel on anything to do with technology and there's an academic, they'll say, we need researcher access to data. Researchers always need data. That's what research is about. I think the concern is that this whole issue around researcher access to data can be potentially used to hold up a lot of other stuff, because, oh, we need to do more research on that. And I think researchers operate in a particular space, and we shouldn't allow platforms to use that to their own advantage. So to give you a full picture, at the same time where the DSA has enshrined researcher access to data and then over time will bed in this process, the platforms have turned off the tap on researcher access to data. They've shut down the APIs, Meta shut down CrowdTangle. They also put a lot of funding schemes that might be supporting researcher also being closed down. So from a researcher perspective, it's great that in principle there will be this process, but like there's a bigger picture here. And if the platforms are already shutting off the tap, why should we believe again that they will act in good faith? And I think it's the good faith argument or problem that I keep coming back to. Everything hinges on them acting in good faith. And if not, a researcher submits their application for access. What are the ways that the platforms can hold that up? And what they have done previously, some of them, is just give really bad data and then go, sorry. And that's not how people can, apply for research projects. And in fact, the Horizon Europe calls that are currently out in the democracy strand, there is a requirement to explain how will you access relevant data because researchers can't access data. And there are private companies that are now providing this access, which is, I think, a massive waste of public money. But, that will be solved in time once Article 40 beds in. But, it's hard to get overexcited about something when at the same time you think the platforms should have been doing this anyway because we're talking about massive risks to our society.
Thank you so much, Eileen. I will now come to you, Natalie, if you have thoughts you want to share.
Yes, of course. On the skills question, I was actually really happy to hear that John not only mentioned tech and legal expertise, but also social science expertise. And I think that is something that we underestimate. So we hear law and regulation and algorithms and think immediately of technicians, computer scientists and lawyers. But actually, to make the DSA work for society, we also need social science and humanities expertise to really understand what the role of these platforms is in society and what are the requirements and needs of society and how to make this work. About making work, when is the DSA a success? I think, yes, citizens have rights under DSA. I think I would consider the DSA a success if they actually are able to exercise these rights and something happens, something good happens. And I gave this example for Meta and the non-profiling exception, with purpose, because from a consumer perspective, this is not really an improvement of their situation, that they now can either pay for Facebook or continue being profiled. So, and I think that relates a bit also to Eileen's good faith argument. When the next survey we do, when citizens indicate that they actually have meaningful, interesting choices that really help them, and they do not feel simply commercialized and overcome by algorithms, I think then the DSA is a success.
Thank you so much, Natalie. One other question from you before we go to the audience. So we talked a lot about regulators, but achieving the DSA's vision may rely on more than just regulators. So we've already mentioned a bit about the trusted flaggers, and there's some discussion about this, and some think perhaps there hasn't been as much uptake of trusted flaggers as would have been expected, but it's also still quite early days for the DSA. And then aside from trusted flaggers, there's also a lot of talk about fact checkers. Of course, they are quite different, but there's some debate about their role and how important they are. And then researchers themselves, what can they actually contribute to helping to achieve the goal of the DSA? So just on those other stakeholders involved. Do you want to start, John?
Yeah, sure. On trusted flaggers, so I think we actually, when I said earlier on day one, we were open to applications for trusted flaggers. They're actually very slow to come in. So some conversations happened with civil society organizations, some other public bodies during the summer. We did a bit of promotion of the idea to demystify it, inform people about what the process was like, what they'd be expected to answer during the process. And we did that last autumn, and then we've had a number of applications since then. The central bank is a great one. A couple of other trusted flaggers interested in areas largely or somewhat to do with kind of commercial rights-based organizations. And limited number so far in the, say, hate speech category or in the minor protection category. But different countries are having different experiences of that. So I can't actually speak for the whole lot. I think we are aware that whereas some of the platforms might have run trusted flagger schemes themselves or something very similar and paid for that, some organizations might be reluctant to switch into a statutory scheme. Okay, so maybe there's something to think about as regards kind of the funding model there in the future. Researchers, yeah, I think researchers have a very important role to play. I don't want to overpromise on the research access. This is something that it's going to take a bit of time to bed down. It's not going to be, come October or whatever the date is that the data tap will turn back on. It's going to be a bit of a slog, I think, getting that to work properly. So some patience is understood. I hear Eileen's point though about there's a lot of existing research out there, and it's up to us to begin to try to turn that into evidence and actionable material, and that requires capacity building inside the organizations as well, and hiring the right people who bring that with them. What was the third category?
I mentioned also fact checkers.
Oh, fact checkers. Maybe Eileen, you'd like to talk about that one?
Yeah, well, I'll go to Irene and then maybe Eileen again.
Yep. I don't have much to add. The difference is that trusted flaggers is something that is foreseen in the DSA. We wanted to formalize something that already existed in the past, in particular in the field of IP, but also for minors protection. The hotlines were already working on that voluntary relationship with the platforms, and we wanted to give them this official status and the possibility to be recognized as such by the platforms. There is nothing on financing trusted flaggers, and this is a question that has come across, and we are working also on guidelines that we will issue as regards trusted flaggers, and we will not necessarily put money on the table, but we will ensure the legal certainty or at least we will aim to give the legal certainty to ensure that financing does not take away the independence of the trusted flaggers. This is a balance that needs to be done. Instead, the figure of fact checkers is not in the DSA. It's nowhere. There is no obligation to work with fact checkers. The truth is that in the code of conduct, for instance, on this information, the work with fact checkers is one of the commitments, and some of the very large online platforms have already entered into that scenario. But there are other very large online platforms who work on the basis of community notes. So they have the community fact-checking, in a way, the content. And Wikipedia is one, X is the other. And we are not saying this system does not work. You don't have to work with this or that fact-checkers. In terms of financing fact-checkers, this is something that could happen in the context of the Code of Conduct, but not within the DSA. Obviously, we also have to bear in mind that the Code of Conduct on this information, the Code of Practice, is now a DSA Code of Conduct. So compliance with the commitments in the Code of Practice are now checked in the audits. As much as people will consider this paperwork, it is important that if they commit to do something, we can also prove that they are abiding to those commitments. And what was the third one?
On fact checkers, researchers.
Yeah, the researchers, I come back to what I said before. We have hopes that researchers are the first showing the smoking gun. Whenever there is a systemic risk that is appearing, obviously we remain always aware of what is cooking. But for instance, the challenges in social networks that have led to harms for minors. This is something maybe 5 years ago did not exist. I put 5 years in general, but things evolve. And there are things that are happening now that did not happen before, and there will be new things, and we will need to have access to people who will know how to grasp and how to identify these issues in the algorithms themselves. So we have a great hope that researchers will do this work, and to the extent that the researchers, obviously, as it was said, they don't live off data and air, that they can make a living of that. If we can help with that, we are already helping on the technical side of things. We are creating a researcher portal to ensure that it is not too burdensome to request access to data. And this is something that we will obviously open for discussion.
Okay, thank you, Irene. Eileen, do you want to come in on this question?
Yeah, I might answer in terms of the code of conduct on disinformation, which is actually the main source of some of my hesitation around compliance, because in DCU, we published 4 reports on what was then a code of practice. And then through the EU-wide EDMO network, we participated in reviews where we tried to verify the platform's claims about what they'd been doing to combat disinformation. And the pain of reading through those transparency reports with information that was just vague, completely random, or just missing is really what has led to a lot of my hesitation around compliance reporting. And if you think, I think the EDMO network is really interesting. So this is part funded by the EU to have a hub that covers every EU country with a fact checker, a researcher, and a media literacy practitioner. And in some countries, they have huge networks of these. But the problem is it's only part funded. So this, in ideal scenario, would be the ideal body to kind of feed in, but it's only part funded. Any work we've done trying to verify claims in the code of practice, now conduct, has been done voluntarily. And a lot of people have found, you know, so we asked the fact checkers, review these claims in the code, and they just went, this doesn't relate to my daily life as a fact checker, which makes it much harder to ask them to volunteer their time to engaging with it. And on fact checking specifically, I mean, all fact checkers are hit with the bombshell of Mark Zuckerberg accusing them of being completely biased and saying they're not going to fund them in the US anymore, which puts a big question mark over whether they're going to fund them in Europe. And they rely very much on the money they get from Facebook or Meta carrying their fact checks. So that's a huge, huge question. And then in terms of the community notes, I think the whole fact checking community is desperately waiting to see what the Commission is going to say about community notes. But the Spanish fact checker Matilde did a really interesting investigation into community notes on X, and it found that the most cited source, so when a member of the community wants to say, you know, this isn't right, they're turning to fact checkers. Fact checkers are the most cited source. And in fact, the Irish fact checker, I think, was amongst the world's top 30 because it's in English. So the model, if they get away with it, is say, oh, we'll go to the community. And then the community is relying on the fact checkers. And now who's going to pay the fact checkers? Because the platforms have pulled the plug. And then it's obviously clearly not appropriate to have fact checkers entirely paid for by political entities. So I think there's a huge question there around how is fact checking maintained viable into the future?
Thank you so much. And Natalie, do you have some comments you'd like to add before we turn to our audience?
Very briefly, I'm glad that we are broadening this discussion and recognizing that the DSA, the way it is conceptualized and works, is really relying on a network of accountability actors, be that fact checkers, trusted labelers, or labelers or researchers, and this is kind of new, and I think we also shouldn't underestimate the importance of making sure that this accountability ecosystem is actually healthy, works, and there are good feedback loops between, for example, the research community and the European Commission. And I think events like these today are very encouraging in that respect. But I really think we need to realize that we need to invest in a healthy accountability ecosystem. In terms of research, also make sure that we not only look into US-based research, and actually I know that at the Commission, but also at a lot of these tech companies, there's very much a tendency to look into first US-based research, ACM, FACT, and so far, but also into a very vibrant ecosystem of European research into these matters, because in the end, the effect that these platforms have on Europe, on fundamental rights in Europe, on European citizens, this is a question that has to be studied as well. And there we can not only rely on reports in ICM. I looked into some of the model cards, how large technology companies assess risk, and where these companies indicate themselves how very biased their selection of researchers is they're listening to or not. And I think we need to be really aware of that, and create effective feedback loops that also work for researchers, because researchers are not the extended arms of enforcement, right? So we have our own way of working. And I think we really need to find ways to make it work for all parties. And I think we're doing that also through discussions like today, but it's not trivial.
Thank you so much, Natalie. And now if we could have a show of hands from the audience, and my colleague Dylan here will come to you with the microphone. And we might take 2 questions together and then take a question online as well. Dylan, do you want to go?
Hi. Thank you so much. Let me introduce myself. My name is Aisha. I'm a digital marketer for the past 21 years. So I'm literally in the ed tech business. And when you're talking about behaviors, we are where we are because Google started with don't do evil, right? But that's not where we are. So unless there are antitrust, huge lawsuits or investigations with huge fines, these companies are not going to change their behavior. And you're talking about an ecosystem where you can never opt out because you're being tracked by fingerprinting. But cookies, with cookie banners came in with GDPR, how many of you actually took a look at exactly how many companies are tracking you? So I think I'm not pessimistic, but I think where I see the gap is really understanding how these platforms work. Because you are looking at a closed ecosystem like Google, who controls how publishers serve their inventory and pressures them. You're looking at a system of being controlled search. You're looking at a system of how advertisers are giving money. And when you're talking about researchers, I was running 80 million pounds of advertising budget. And when I actually go to Google and ask for log level data, I cannot get it. So the fact that we rely on them to give you data is just not going to work. And you have these platforms who are supposed to do verification and brand safety, but we just uncovered in the US that they're serving US federal government ads on child pornography sites. So if you're relying on flag checkers, they're not going to be able to flag anything that they cannot see. So I think at the end of the day, if this is not actively based on some sort of a platform, automated, being technologized and really scraping what we need to do, I don't necessarily think practically we can do much of it. So I guess my question after this long-winded round is, how much capability do you have in-house in these boards or commissions that can give you these kind of insights that I can give you in terms of how these technologies actually work? Because what I am getting is, do you guys remember when Mark Zuckerberg was in front of the Senate and they were asking how he was making money? Unless we understand exactly how these platforms work, in theoretically, it's great, but we have a bigger problem with AI now. So I just read earlier today, I'm sorry for being long, but this is very near and dear to my heart, and you can understand how much I hate these big tech. But Meta is using the Meta AI app and training the algorithm from Instagram and Facebook, and you cannot opt out. You're already opt in. So there's an injunction currently for EU that can completely possibly ban Meta AI, but that's going to take longer. So we have an AI adoption that's happening, and I'm just worried where we're going. So that's the end of my question, I guess. Like, I just want to know what capabilities you have in-house to guide you in terms of how these technologies work.
Thank you so much, Aisha. I think we have some more questions over here. We'll take one more question, and there's a question online. I'll go back to the panel.
My question about Russian propaganda and state-sponsored malign influences. So I represent the research. There was a very comprehensive research done by several think tanks and universities showing that Russia successfully spreads disinformation across Facebook, X, etc. In our experience, we testified in the European Parliament. European Commission has received this report. My question is a little bit this. Help me to navigate. How does it work? You said that the European Commission shares some responsibilities, and then the regulators share some responsibilities when it comes to forcing the platforms to take down content that is already sanctioned by European Union. Meaning, if Russia today spreads disinformation on, or its affiliated organizations spread disinformation, whose job it is, how does it exactly work? to force them to take down? Because our experience, you mentioned this word of urgency, and unfortunately we haven't seen this word in practice, this urgency, because from Poland to Germany, disinformation, including election disinformation, is spread successfully. Also, you have Romania, etc. And so whose job it is to force this big tech to take down content that is already illegal by European law? So, example, Russia today in Germany has been re-deplatformized, right, or etc. How do we work around it? How to civil society, in cooperation with regulators and in cooperation with European Commission, how do we actually make this urgency work and turn it into like a rapid response, not that takes half a year once elections are over, etc.
Sorry, could you give us your name and
Oh,
organization
sorry,
there?
Dmitro Raisky, PR Army.
Thank you so much. So we've a question here online as well that I'll read out, and it's a question specifically for you, Irene. So it's from Jonathan Keane, a journalist at The Currency. And his specific question is, do you have views on overlaps between the DSA and Ireland's online safety code? And perhaps a more general question, do you have views on overlaps between the DSA and other legislation and the challenges of that? So we might start with you, Irene, if you want to comment on that specific question, and also the challenges of understanding technology and foreign propaganda, and then we'll go to the other panelists.
Sure, I can reply to all the three questions. On that specific question, knowing that it is before the national courts, I would prefer not to comment. The Commission was notified of the draft, as it is always the case when a member state wants to adopt a law that imposes obligations on information society services. They have to notify it to the Commission, and then we open a dialogue and we check, and we had that dialogue and we did not issue any red flag. And now it is for, as far as I know, the national courts to determine. So I don't have anything else to say. Then on the capabilities, I think all the knowledge that you have shown is the knowledge that we share. And believe me, we have dedicated a lot of time to hire the best. And we know very well how these platforms work. Then we have the tools that we have that co-legislators agreed, and we will use to the best of our capabilities. On the pay or consent, we have issued a fine under the DMA, under the Digital Markets Act. And there is, you may agree or disagree with the results, but the pay or consent issue is an issue from the data protection perspective, from the consumer protection perspective, from the Digital Markets Act perspective. For the DSA, the fact that you get the free version does not mean that you are not subject to, you don't have the right to opt out for recommender systems. The right under Article 38 applies also when you prefer not to pay. So this is not a binary solution. And then on the question on the Russian propaganda, the DSA is not about taking down content. There's nothing in the DSA that would give the Commission any power. It would not give John any power to take down content. And it should not be like that. It is about processes. It's about how the platforms are designed. Then if content is illegal, then they have to design their systems in a way that illegal content is not disseminated, and even more disseminated than other content. But this is our area of action. We are not determining which content should be taken down and which content should stay up.
Thank you so much, Irene. I will go to Natalie online just to mix up the order. Natalie, do you have some comments you'd like to give to some of those questions?
I think there's not much I can add to this. I'm very happy to hear that there is a lot of investment also on the side of the Commission to actually really understand how these platforms work and the business models. Because I agree, this is crucial to take away any illusions and effectively enforce the rules.
Yeah, thank you so much. Eileen, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I just think maybe Dimitri's question kind of gets to the heart of what I was trying to get at, which again is not about criticizing the DSA as such, but saying that there's going to be this fundamental gap where Dimitri's talking about sanctioned entities spreading disinformation about EU policy, about EU countries, and about Ukraine, and then there's just not a lot they can do about it, which is going to be extremely frustrating because you go, we thought these entities had been sanctioned, and that's when they think, oh, well, this is flagship legislation, but that's just not what it does. So I do feel quite sorry for the people who are forced to implement the DSA that are now having to deal with the fact that there was a lot of maybe hype and people were led to believe it was going to do things it wasn't going to do, and now you have to deal with the fallout of that. And I think that's probably something to address with some urgency, that it's clear what it does and it doesn't do to people. And I know that's not easy for regulators to do because they're not necessarily in a kind of space of saying, well, the politicians and commissioners shouldn't have said that, but that's pretty much where it is. And I think to your point, it's a really good one because it's about the ecosystem. And when I listen to researchers who read through all the transparency reports and the compliance reports and the first systematic risk reports that came out, it's very striking and just a little depressing when you hear them say, well, this is great. So we have the first round of reports, and as we expected, these aren't very informative. But in a few years, we'll build up a picture of how risks on this platform relate to, and you go, like, this is missing the point about it being an ecosystem. And we're still thinking of them being these discrete entities where they have already captured so many sectors. And I fully believe that the people you're working with do understand this, but it's a problem of how do you actually address that with the regulatory system that we have.
Yeah, thank you so much, Eileen. John, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I don't have anything particularly new to add to that, maybe except in terms of the capability question. So we certainly have taken people who understand how the advertising model works, how it works around branding, technical aspects as well. But regulators often draw on really specialist expertise from outside. That's a normal activity for a regulator is to rely on expert evidence and expert contributions from outside. So there'll be quite a bit of that too.
So we've one question here online, and they're asking this question for our two regulators. What does best efforts look like when it comes to enforcement? How do you distinguish between a platform that's just not taking its responsibilities seriously and one that's actually facing a huge challenge? Because, of course, there can be cases where a company may be very deserving of criticism, but they also moderate a huge amount of content. And if I could couple that with a question as well about the way they moderate content, the balance between human moderators and algorithmic moderation. Do you like to start on that question?
Yeah, go first. Yeah. I think it goes to risk. So the first question was, what does best efforts mean? Okay, how do you distinguish between whether or not? Okay, I think that you understand that through the supervisory relationship that you have with them. You learn pretty quick whether or not an entity is making an effort to comply, is changing their behavior, or is not, and it's really apparent in the interaction that you have. And what that means then in practice is that you accelerate towards enforcement more quickly. It's really early days for the DSA still. The Commission has advanced quite a number of cases quite quickly, and the other regulators are a little bit behind that. So you guys are on the pitch probably about 2 years now. Yeah, the rest of us are there about a year. But
do you want to come in, Erin?
I think our experience matches very much what John has explained. It's something that you sense. Obviously, we always go into regulatory dialogues with good faith, and we usually expect the others to go also in good faith. And in general, this has been also our experience. But it's not about best efforts. It depends on the obligation. Some obligations are binary. Some others are obligations of means rather than of results, and we have to see whether those means are being put in place. But it is difficult to say in the abstract and in general.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we've time for one final question from the audience, and my colleague Dylan will come to you. Please try to keep it brief just because we're running tight on time, and give the panel a quick chance to come in.
Yeah, so my name is Deirdre Kilroy. I'm a partner in Bird & Bird. We advise clients on the DSA, and I just observed that there's kind of two two streams really, and much of the conversation today has been on the very large operators where there's active audit engagement and dialogue, but there's a huge group that are regulated by the DSA, kind of in the successor to the e-commerce directive, that are hosting providers, caching providers, and other platforms. And I'd just like to hear the two regulators talk about their approach to the others, to the non very large platforms that actually have kind of content issues in relation to engagement.
Thank you so much. That's a really interesting question, I think. And one other question there, Dylan, just from Jane. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I'm just wondering about the kind of, I know the Irish Council for Civil Liberties here had a suggestion that the VLOPs could be asked to turn off recommender algorithms for under 18s. And I understood that that was impossible. But then I'm wondering how that fits with the idea that you should be able to request it. So I just don't quite understand the parameters of both of those things. If somebody could explain it to me, it'd be great.
Thank you so much. So I guess I'll turn to John and Irene on the non-VLOPs first, if you want to make comments on that.
Yeah, so on the non-VLOPs, when I was kind of giving my opening remarks, I mentioned that there were we think about 150 platforms. So they fall into the category of platform, like a very large online platform, except that their coverage is below the 45 million. And that we think there's probably another 200 or so other intermediary service providers based in Ireland. There is a kind of tiered levels of obligations around VLOPs down to platforms and then other intermediary service providers. The local DSCs have responsibility for everything that's below threshold. Our approach so far has been, I think I mentioned this as well, is sort of do some of the basics with a cohort of the platforms first, but it's going to take some time to get out to the rest of the distribution, if you like. If we become aware of something that's particularly egregious or looks very risky, we will act as soon as we hear something like that. But in terms of actual market monitoring and active supervision, getting to know your regulated entities is going to take time to understand the breadth of that 150 plus another 200.
Thank you so much, John. Natalie, would you like to come in on recommender algorithms? Given
Yes.
that you talked about it, can you give your views on whether or not it's desirable and why it wouldn't be to switch off recommender algorithms?
Yeah, thank you. To put it maybe a bit provocatively, I think presenting consumers with a choice to either switch on or switch off personalization and recommender system alone is simply unfair. I think we need to understand that these platforms and these recommender systems are by now a fixed part of our information ecosystem. So these are the ways how a large part of the society inform themselves. So it's not simply a question of switching on or off personalization. I think it's really a question of having a discussion how we can make sure that these recommenders also optimize for the information needs of users. So not only for engagement or profit or clicks, but also for the information needs of consumers, because they're really part of our public information infrastructure. And we have not invested in alternative infrastructures, large-scale infrastructures for users to get this information. The media organizations, politicians, everybody is using these platforms to inform users. And under these circumstances, simply giving a binary on-off choice, this is not what democracy is about, or what the role of recommenders and algorithms in society should be about.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Irene, would you like to come in on either of those questions about the non-VLOPs or about recommender algorithms?
For the non-VLOPs, it's not under our competence. The digital services coordinators are the exclusive competence. What we do from the European Commission is to gather the views from all DSCs and the cases that they are confronting. And we have, in the context of the DSA board, we have a working group in particular dealing with horizontal and legal issues where we discuss real life cases that they are confronted. So we know very well what are the issues that appear, not only on the platforms. So we also mentioned mere conduits are still a thing, and they are the pipelines that we all trust to have access to the internet, and caching services, other hosting services, web hosting, and all this is in scope. It's just that they don't catch the attention of the user because we are all facing the content side of what we see in the mobile phones. On the other question, on the recommender system, what the DSA says is that they have to build a recommender system that is not based on personalization. And that's what you can't opt out. Obviously, all content needs to be organized in a way, and every organization is a recommender system in a way, even if it's a historic timeline, the newer comes first. It's also a recommendation in a way because it's an order in the content. And what the DSA allows is to opt out from a personalized recommender system.
Thank you so much, Irene. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, I think, for the event. We've gone slightly over. There's still lots more questions that we could talk about at a future date. Hopefully, we can do this event again in the near course. So thank you so much to our panelists for being with us today. Thank you so much to the audience for all the great questions online and here in person today. And thank you again to the Economic Regulators Network for collaborating with us on this event. Thank you so much.